Hello everybody, it's me and welcome back to another episode of our channel. And today we are going to be talking about why the Mafia used Catholic churches for crime. So this is something that has been on my mind for a long time, because when you think about the Mafia, you always hear about how they used to meet in buildings like pizzerias or bars or restaurants. And it was only until fairly recently that I realized that no, they actually preferred to meet in churches. They actually preferred to meet in Catholic churches. So why did they do this? Why did they use Catholic churches for their crimes? Well, in order to understand that, we first have to understand what the Catholic Church was like during the time period in which the Mafia was forming, and also kind of just understand what the Mafia even was. So the Mafia was a secret society. They wanted to keep their activities hidden from the police, and they also wanted to keep their activities hidden from most of the people who lived in the cities where they committed their crimes. Because if their crimes were known, then people would, not necessarily want to live in those places. Same thing with the police. They didn't want the police to know that they were committing crimes in these areas, so they needed a place where they could go that was completely safe. A place where they could go and hide out and plan their crimes without anybody knowing about it. Well, there was actually two different groups at this time in Sicily that provided them the perfect solution to this problem. The first group was the Camorra. The Camorra was a criminal organization that had formed in Naples, Italy, around the 1860s. Now, of course, the Mafia came after that, but by that time, the Camorra had already created a strong foundation for the Mafia to build off of later. So the Camorra was led by a council of elders, similar to the Mafia, and they had control over all of the major forms of crime, including gambling, extortion, and prostitution. They even went as far as controlling entire neighborhoods. So in order for anyone who lived in those neighborhoods to get anything done, they had to go through the Camorra and ask for their permission. And sometimes that meant that they had to pay money to the Camorra. And sometimes it meant that they had to commit crimes for the Camorra. But basically, if you lived in their neighborhood and you wanted to do something, you had to go through the Camorra. That's how powerful they were. So if you're starting to see a connection between the Camorra and the Mafia yet, that was because the Mafia actually formed because of the Camorra. After the Italian unification in 1861, the Camorra began to decline in power and wealth, and so a new group rose up to take their place. This new group was called the Mafia, so they took the blueprint that the Camorra had laid out for them, and they built upon it. Like the Camorra, though, the Mafia focused primarily on extortion and the illegal production of food. But as time went on, they grew and expanded, and eventually they controlled every major city in Italy, as well as several cities in the United States. So now let's talk about the other group that helped the Mafia thrive. Obviously, the Mafia wasn't operating in a vacuum. They existed alongside other groups and organizations, and one of those groups were the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church at this time was massive. I mean, it still is massive, but it was especially massive during this time period, because it stretched its fingers into every facet of life. I mean, really, if you wanted to get married, you had to go to the church. If you wanted to have your kids, you had to go to the church. If you wanted to die and go to heaven, you had to go to the church. So yeah, the church pretty much played a role in every aspect of life at this time. This gave them an incredible amount of power over the people who lived in those communities. So of course, they weren't going to use that power to further their own criminal enterprises. Oh no, because that would be wrong. But they did, however, allow criminal organizations such as the Mafia to use their buildings for meetings, because it gave them a level of safety that they couldn't get anywhere else. I mean, think about it. What would the police be doing raiding a church? I mean, even today, you don't hear about cops storming churches and arresting people, although I'm sure it's happened. But you don't hear about it because it's so rare. So obviously, back then, it was even more rare, because churches were seen as sacred places where only God and his followers could tread. And so it was a perfect place for the Mafia to meet, because nobody would suspect a thing. Of course, this caused problems for the church later on because they were directly linked to the Mafia. But they didn't really care at the time, because they didn't really even know what the Mafia was. I mean, they knew that they were criminals, but they didn't know that they were planning to build an empire. They thought that they were just a small-time gang that was operating in the shadows. So it really didn't bother them too much that the Mafia was using their churches for meetings. In fact, it kind of made them seem like they were part of something bigger than themselves. But of course, that would change as time went on, because as the Mafia grew, the church began to lose its power. And so when that happened, they became very worried about the fact that they were being associated with criminals. There are many instances where this happened. For example, there was a man named Ignazio Silvestro. He was a priest who was working in a church in San Giovanni a Tiberio, Rome. He was there in 1927 when a local mafia boss was arrested. And apparently the police found a gun and a few bullets in Father Silvestro's apartment. And so they questioned him about it, and he said that the gun belonged to a friend of his, who had asked him to keep it for safekeeping, but the police didn't believe him. They thought that he was part of the mafia, and so they put him in jail. Of course, Father Silvestro was innocent, but he spent 6 months in jail before he was finally able to prove his innocence. But that's just one example. There were many others. Like, for example, there was a man named Giuseppe Impastato. He was a mafia boss who was living in the town of Sinisi, Italy, and he used a local church as a meeting place for his criminal organization. But one day the police got a tip that he was planning to rob a train that was carrying gold from the Bank of Italy to the airport. So they decided to set up a roadblock and wait for him. But when they searched the church, they didn't find anything. Didn't find any weapons or any evidence that he was planning a robbery, so they let him go. But little did they know that he had bribed the local priest to warn him that the police were coming, so he was able to escape, and he was never caught. So there were many instances where the church was used for illegal activities, and this caused a lot of problems for the church, because people began to associate them with the mafia. Now, of course, the mafia didn't help this situation, because they tried to recruit priests into their organization. Like, for example, there was a man named Father Luca di Fulvio, was a priest who was working in a church in Partenico, Italy, and he was approached by the mafia to become their chaplain. Basically, they wanted him to hear confessions from mafia members and absolve them of their sins. Well, he agreed to do this, but he also agreed to secretly report their activities to the police. So he was kind of like a double agent, if you will. But eventually the mafia found out about this and they threatened him. They told him that if he didn't stop reporting them to the police, they would kill him, so he decided to flee. He left the priesthood and he changed his name to Father Luca de Luca, and he lived out the rest of his life in hiding. There were many priests like Father Luca di Fulvio who tried to fight back against the mafia, but most of them didn't succeed. Most of them ended up dead. So that's why I wanted to make this video. I wanted to show you why the church was so closely tied to the mafia, and it's because the mafia used the church for their own benefit, used it for protection, for secrecy, and for power. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful night.